Welcome, everyone. I am Mariana Pavlovskaya. I'm chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Science here at Hunter College. My own research focuses on urban space and geographies of diverse and solidarity economies in the United States and in Russia. So welcome, everyone, not only to our department, but also to the National Geography Awareness Week. During this week, we make an extra effort to spread around geographic knowledge among students and general public. This knowledge explains relationships between different places and between people and the environment, and does so across space and across scales from global to local. So all these are like terms from geographic knowledge. So, and this knowledge cannot be more important today in the times of climate emergency and profound social and economic inequality. And more than ever today, we understand that the vital need to achieve sustainability will not be fulfilled without eliminating social injustices. It has not worked for humanity so far. Only a society that seeks to free itself from all kinds of exploitation and oppression would be able to thrive towards sustainability. And this is the message that we hear from the United Nations Climate Summit, which is taking place as we speak. And this is what I think we will also hear from our keynote speaker, Ms. Carolina Behe, who today will be talking about the connections between the indigenous and scientific knowledge. Are we good? Everyone? Okay, good. So before I introduce Carolina, I want to say that we have several events planned for this week. Some of those events already have taken place last week and this week. And all of our events are listed on our departmental website. Amy, maybe you could drop the link to this website. So please join. All these events are very exciting, and we would be very happy to see you there. So now brief thanks. So I would like to thank our CLT Amy Ju, who provides support for this event over Zoom, to Professor Mohammed Ibrahim for opening his class to this event, to our college assistant, Olivia Ujinsky, for managing the overflow room and watch party, and to Professor Ellen Fry, who put me in touch with Carolina, and of course to Ms. Carolina Behe, who accepted my invitation. So I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Carolina Behe. One of the most exciting things is that Carolina received a BA in Environmental Studies from our department in 2010. She did it as part of CUNY Baccalaureate for Unique and Interdisciplinary Studies. She then received a master's degree in Biodiversity and Conservation from Scripps Institution of Oceanography in 2011, if I'm correct. Carolina has then worked for 11 years as the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council on a range of climate change and policy issues. Her work focused on food security, food sovereignty, co-production of knowledge, and equitable involvement of indigenous peoples and their knowledge. Most recently, Carolina has joined the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries as the Cultural Resource Coordinator, where she will work to strengthen and support indigenous engagement. The title of Carolina's talk is Bringing Together Indigenous Knowledge and Science, a Need for a Paradigm Shift. So also, Amy is probably dropping in the chat a list of resources about this issue that Carolina generously shared with us. We will also post it on our website. And in terms of the format of the lecture, so I believe we are going to listen to Carolina first, and then Q&A part will begin after she finishes her talk. You can drop your questions in the chat, or you can then raise your hand and ask it in person. And I believe you can raise your hand both digitally over Zoom and while in person in the classroom. Oh my God, so many options in this world. So welcome again, Carolina. We are very excited.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of the words you shared. I think you'll hear a lot of them in what I shared today. Can you hear me okay?
We could hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. So I'm very humbled to be joining all of you today, and thank you for welcoming me here. As shared, I received a bachelor's degree working with the Geography Department of Hunter and gained a lot from my time with Hunter: knowledge, guidance, and support. All that I gained has aided me in working across scales, from within remote communities to international tables. Here is where I began to organize my thoughts and voice that is not always in line with the majority. Today, I still work at holding this confidence and have needed to work across knowledge systems that is needed to work across knowledge systems and disciplines. As shared, for the past 11 years, I've been working with an international team as the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And I recently changed positions and accepted a position with the National Oceanography Atmospheric Administration with the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. Most of what I share with you today reflects the work done while working within the Arctic. But this is only part of the journey. It only describes the time that many of us put words to these thoughts. All of our journeys really begin with birth or before. This is when our cosmologies begin to take shape, how we see the world, how we learn to interact within the world, how we learn to be part of that world. This is all important when we talk about topics of climate change, equity, co-production of knowledge, research, monitoring, assessments, management, really anything. There are many ways for this discussion to take place. There are so many pieces to it, but we're going to focus on the rapidly changing world, climate change, Indigenous peoples, food security and sovereignty, equity, co-production of knowledge, and one of the paradigm shifts that our world needs to make. As we go through this discussion, terms like food security and sovereignty will be shared. Some pieces may remind you of an ecosystem approach, and some concepts may sound familiar. If possible, I'm going to ask you to try not to think of what you know of these terms or concepts, or to hear the little bit that is shared here as its own. And when we come back to our collective and unique understandings during the discussions, we'll reflect on these parts. To aid us in the discussion, we will rely on a few conceptual frameworks and concepts derived from Indigenous perspectives and through a co-production of knowledge. The topics of climate change, biodiversity, biodiversity loss, human rights, and human loss, movements of animals, gender rights, equity, water, food security, and food sovereignty are all topics of extreme importance. And all of these topics are interconnected with each other. They are all being actively discussed around the world and right now at the COP27 for the UNFCCC. We need for Indigenous peoples to be part of these discussions, to fully understand what is happening, to collectively develop adaptive and holistic solutions, to safeguard and support biodiversity and the environments that we are all part of, and to honor Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and self-determination, a key part to human rights. Through this discussion, and hopefully moving forward, we need for everybody to recognize that Indigenous peoples are not stakeholders, they are rights holders, and there is a difference. There are a few tools out there to learn about Indigenous peoples' homelands, such as the one provided by Native Land Digital. This is not a complete map, but it does give you an idea of Indigenous peoples' traditional lands and languages spoken. Within these areas, there are thousands of years worth of knowledge and proven sustainable practices, both onshore and offshore. Today, Indigenous peoples' lands and territories encompass about 22% of the global land surfaces. This coincides with areas that hold about 80% of the planet's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples' sustainable and holistic practices and use of Indigenous knowledge support these areas. There is a growing appreciation for Indigenous knowledge across the world, and every day there seems to be a stronger recognition. of the need for multi-knowledge-based approaches, but we continue to face challenges to see this happen. So let's begin with a common understanding of Indigenous knowledge. Peoples, cultures, societies, knowledges guide their understanding of and relationships with everything. Knowledge is part of how we see the world. It is part of our identities. This cannot be separated out from our values or our worldviews. Not all Indigenous peoples' knowledge is the same, and it is important to respect and trust the knowledge of your partners. For today, we will follow this definition provided by the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It includes insights based on evidence and acquired through direct and long-term experiences and extensive and multi-generational observations, lessons, and skills. It has developed over millennia, and it is still developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future, and is passed on from generation to generation. Under this definition, Indigenous knowledge goes beyond observations, ecological knowledge, offering a unique way of knowing to identify research needs and apply to research, monitoring, assessments, decision-making, policy, and overall understanding the world. It is a way of life. Key points to remember here. This definition emphasizes that Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking, that it holds its own methodologies and evaluation processes. To aid us in seeing Indigenous knowledge at work, we share this image. This drawing is made up of Indigenous knowledge. The Inuit Circumpolar Council has given me permission to share this image with you today. This drawing reflects an Inuit ecosystem. We drew it because everything else that was describing the Arctic didn't show all of these relationships. This ecosystem is made up of multiple and diverse parts. Everything shown is needed and is equally important. There is not a hierarchy here. Here you have feasts. This is just as important as the polychaetes. These are just as important as zooplankton and as the lichen, and just as important as this youth sharing his first catch with an elder. As one elder explained, the Arctic ecosystem is like puzzle pieces. You have language here, sharing, education, and all of this makes up the entire picture. These pieces are continuously adjusting to one another, but are all connected. Some may see the similarities to systems here. Language is part of a system and is interlinked with biodiversity, that's interlinked with hydrosystems, and so on. Another part of this ecosystem is economics. This is a healthy environment. It is also what describes food security. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But for now, notice that food security goes well beyond nutrients and calories. In this environment, in all environments, a challenge arises when some come and look at only one piece of the puzzle. Maybe they just want to look at this beluga right here. And they decide to make policy recommendations. They decide what should be done in this environment without understanding the interconnecting components, relationships, or understanding cumulative impacts. To make decisions in this environment, it is important to understand and pay attention to relationships. It is important to understand that the health of this hunter depends on this whale, but also that the health of the whale depends on the health of the hunter. Indigenous knowledge tells us here that the greatest points of vulnerability lie where these pieces interconnect. If the pieces begin to separate, to not connect, there's a large problem, maybe a tipping point. Some of you may recognize this as being similar to an ecosystem perspective. However, this concept goes beyond that and begins to explain how we are seeing the environment. Humans are part of this ecosystem. Under Indigenous knowledge, this cannot be separated out. What we decide to work on, what questions to ask, and how we conduct that work to bring forward evidence-based information is determined by how we are taught to see the world, how we are taught to take information in. This is part of our cosmology. Through Indigenous knowledge, people are often asking different questions than science. Indigenous knowledge is different from science, and that is good. We need both of them. We need both in research, monitoring, assessments, decision-making, policy setting, to manage our relationships with everything, and to face the many challenges that we see today and moving forward. To give an example of these different views and knowledge systems, we are going to jump back to food security. Through work done with Inuit from across Alaska, a food security definition was developed. This definition is very different from the one that's used within the Food and Agricultural Organization. The first sentence of this definition states that food security is the natural right of all Inuit to be part of the ecosystem, to access food, to caretake, protect, and respect all of life, land, water, and air. I encourage you to read through the whole definition and to read the report. But for now, I just want to emphasize that when people say the natural right, they are not talking about property or an individual view of this is mine. They are talking about a collective right to uphold a responsibility to take care of, to be part of this environment that they have evolved with. This definition also holds the understanding that without food sovereignty, food security will not exist. Through this work, a conceptual framework was developed with Inuit. This is the food security conceptual framework that's shaped like a drum. It's shaped like a drum because this is very important in many cultures, not just the Inuit indigenous culture. And in the center, this drum holds all of the components needed to understand a healthy environment. It's all of the components needed for food security. In the center, you have food security. And what's surrounding that is what characterizes food security. That's a healthy environment. Surrounding that are the components that you need in order to have a healthy environment. This includes accessibility, availability, culture, stability, health and wellness, decision-making power and management. On the outside of that are the tools that we need to support those components. We need knowledge sources. We need both Indigenous knowledge and science. We need true co-management. We need policy. On the outside of this drum, I'm not sure if you can see this arrow, but on this upper right-hand side, this is like sinew. You guys know sinew? Sinew is used to like thread, and it holds the drum together. And these are the four main Inuit dialects in Alaska. And each one of these words means the spirit of all, because you can't separate that out. And the drum handle, it's the handle connecting the person holding the drum. And that's the food sovereignty. And when we look at this, we need to not make assumptions about language, because many of us are using English as a second language. And so when we say things like health and wellness, we can't assume what that means. If you did a Google Scholar search, for example, health and wellness would come up with a lot of papers about human health and wellness. But here, Inuit are talking about the health and wellness of everything, about the animals, about the people, about our physical and mental health and wellness, even that relationship that we hold with all of those pieces. Inuit authors of the Food Security Report work have stressed if even one piece is weak or missing within the drum, food security will not be there. This all directly relates to the handle of the drum. The drummer holds the drum by the handle holds up the drum. The conceptual framework, the handle in this, you guys know that the drum handle is food sovereignty. Notice again that the connections here and the focus is on relationships. This is about how we see the world, how we take information in, and how we have relationships in this environment. This worldview is important across geographic and temporal scales. For example, it is just as important for a hunter in a remote community to have information to make decisions related to sea ice movement in front of their house tomorrow, as it is for the hunter and the world to understand the changes that occur related to that sea ice 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. We cannot look at one piece of the puzzle to understand the Arctic or any part of this world. We must consider all of the pieces and how they interlink with each other. And the importance of understanding cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts. We will not go into that part so much today, but this is a part that seems to be missing from a lot of international discussions. All of this information is available in a report that we developed with the Inuit Circumpolar Council on Alaska Inuit Food Security Conceptual Framework, how to assess the Arctic from an Inuit perspective. So why is this important? A food security lens allows for us to see the entire picture, the entire puzzle. We are often asking different questions to inform monitoring, understanding the environment, research, and we need both. We need to understand the connections between the cultural, biological, and physical elements of this world. Well, many may respond to these reports and say, oh yeah, okay, I see. We still are faced with a majority of conversations occurring under one assumed understanding of concepts, such as the concept of conservation. Within these conversations, we then see limited room for multiple understandings, worldviews, knowledge systems, or solutions. Consider the topic of food security and conservation collectively. Here, Inuit food security encompasses much more than nutrients or calories. It is built from a healthy ecosystem in which Inuit are part of, and it has to include conservation. So for example, it's really common working in the Arctic that you might see a research plan that is very focused on understanding the population dynamics of a walrus. And that research plan seems to be very limited on how many walrus are there. But for a hunter has to consider a lot more. A hunter has to consider the sea ice movement, the thickness, the water currents, the wind direction, the salinity, the taste of salt in the water, the stomach contents of the walrus. That will help us know what's happening to the benthic species. We have to think about how the walrus is behaving around other animals and other walruses. This is particularly important right now because there's been a shift in the last couple of years that bearded seals are migrating at the same time as walruses. They don't really like each other that much, and it causes more stress. There's a deep knowledge and respect for the animals. There is a consideration of the young boy who's being taken out every year to learn how to be within his environment, to learn the values and relationships that he holds with that walrus and the other pieces. And at this point, he takes his first catch of a walrus. He provides this catch to an elder. He has now become a provider as opposed to being provided for. This is his self-identity. This is cultural identity. It is part of the ecosystem. This is everything that would have to be considered if you're living in a community like Gamble. This community right up here, it's a walrus hunting community. But it's much more than how many walrus are in the water. This framework with conservation measures is very different from the prevailing conservation concepts that suggest humans be separate from their environment and result in suggested solutions that don't recognize that the health of the walrus and the health of the hunter are interconnected. This is a type of framework demonstrated as Indigenous knowledge, understanding the interconnectivity systems and drive solutions that are multi-species based and across multiple pieces of the ecosystem. Many international institutions addressing world and regional challenges work through existing frameworks solely based on science and non-Indigenous perspectives. For example, the development of assessments, the scoping practices to determine what needs to be focused on, what needs to be reported on, how to report on it, and all of this often occurs without the involvement of Indigenous peoples. In the last 11 years, it was more common that I was asked to attend a meeting to talk about community-based monitoring, where there were no community members there. There were no Indigenous peoples there. I was the only Indigenous representative there. Than it was to have a room filled with Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists collectively working together. These discussions led to decisions that on what an assessment should look like, long before Indigenous peoples are included in the conversation. At this point, a framework is developed and determines how, again, to gather information and analyze that information. Often the information is aggregated only from scientific periodicals. The framework often that we have been discussing how to analyze gathered information, how to use the information, how to make decisions, and what scale the information will be used at, and then used to make policy recommendation. This results, if Indigenous knowledge is considered, it often is treated as anecdotal and is being translated into science. A few additional challenges that we see arising from this approach is the lack of trust and respect, the lack of knowledge of Indigenous peoples, of their knowledge, histories, cosmologies, governance structures. It often results in welcoming Indigenous peoples to sit at a table, but without space, being drowned out by everybody else. And it limits our knowledge of what is actually happening in the world. Doing work through the food security lens, through a holistic and adaptive lens, is only one example of the pieces we need to bring together. Relating this back to a holistic understanding, to understanding the connections between all the pieces that make up the environment that we are all part of, many Indigenous peoples have thousands of years of proven sustainable practices in which cultures is an intricate part of the ecosystem. Within this sustainable management, there are many common rules, values, guidelines, practices, such as never take more than you need, that reinforce this sustainable harvesting. Now, I was working in the Arctic for about 7 years and constantly telling people, don't worry, because everybody knows you can't take more than you need, before I finally realized that the words I was saying weren't being heard the way I intended them to. They were being translated by my audience's culture, which is fair enough, in which they came from a place where people were taking as much as they wanted to. And so it's really important to explain what this means. So never take more than you need means that you need to use all parts of the animal, that you cannot waste any part, that your freezer should be empty in the spring, that you should have shared and taken care of your community. It also means that you have to follow the weather. Processing food often relies on types of weather. For example, when getting salmon, it is important that the weather is conducive to taking care of the fish. It also requires adaptive decision-making. If the weather is raining, if a huge amount more rain is coming, which is happening now, and going to cause the drying fish to mold, you will need to change when you get the fish. A challenge arises when regulations conflict with Indigenous knowledge and what is being observed in that environment. This is often a challenge with management and regulations that are driven solely by one dominating culture and one source of knowledge. It is important to understand how differing values and ways of knowing guide management. For example, many Indigenous peoples' management practices are not single species focused. There's a strong focus on cumulative impacts, understanding relationships between components, and multiple variables. Other challenges arise with regulations and practices that may be focused solely on monetary growth. For example, it's very common within policy and research guidelines to see economically viable. The words are often there to support research or monitoring of what is economically viable. On separating people from the environment and decisions made far from Indigenous homelands, these are some other challenges when there's regulations that separate people from their environment, decisions that are made far from Indigenous homelands with no understanding of the adaptive, quick decisions that are needed to be made for the well-being of the entire ecosystem. Language is another key point raised within all of this work. As I shared before, that we can't make assumptions about what words mean, even if we're all speaking English. But it's also true about assuming that only English should be spoken at the table. So there's a challenge when people are not able to use their own language in management discussions. So for example, there's one community in the Western Canadian Arctic, where in that community, there's 5 words for beluga. And every single one of those words, it's in Inuit language, every single one of those words describes something about that beluga. It might tell you about the age, the relationship that beluga has in going up the river, your relationship, how you're supposed to interact with that beluga. And there's a big problem when you're expected to sit at the table and only say beluga. you're leaving out a huge amount of knowledge and information that describes a holistic environment. Let's jump over very, very briefly to climate change. Just to briefly share some points that have been shared with me over my time working in the Arctic. Through numerous projects and research, climate change has always been brought up. This is just a very, very short list of the things that are brought up. The point that I wanted to share here is that never once was the focus intended to be about climate change, but it was always a key part of the discussion. Elders, active hunters and gatherers, youth, all have consistently brought up these points. They don't always use the term climate change, just like the term biodiversity is not always used, but they're all part of these components. These were a few points that were shared when we were working on the Food Sovereignty and Self-Governance report. Again, there are many, many more changes than that. These are just a few that came up. There are multiple drivers to the changes that are occurring, and it is important to recognize that drivers can be both positive and negative. We have to look at the Arctic holistically. We have to look at the world holistically to understand the interconnecting drivers and cumulative impacts. For example, there are connections between warming sea surface temperatures, change in sea ice movements, growth of berries and other vegetation, animal movement and behavior, conflict of interest, visiting sports hunters, shippings, research vessels, and environmental groups, and extractive industry who are all working and lobbying through single species lenses, economics, pollution, and a young boy giving his first catch to an elder. These are all things that are interconnected to each other. All these components and many more have to be considered when we're thinking about decisions and policy. All of the concerns shared throughout the project or how the concerns are addressed are directly connected to food sovereignty. The participants in this work stress that concern comes from not just change alone. In this dynamic environment, change has been constant, and Inuit have always adapted. Additional concerns come from the lack of respect expressed towards all within the Arctic ecosystem and decisions made with unintentional impacts. Those decisions are sometimes made by individuals, governments, and institutions that are far from the Arctic, by those with differing value systems, by those that take a single species worldview, and from those with a lack of adaptability, a lack of equity, discrimination, and racism within some areas, and a lack of trust and respect for Inuit and their knowledge with decision-making pathways to address these concerns impedes Inuit food sovereignty. And here again, I have to share that working with Indigenous peoples across the world, this has been a common point that has been shared. Additionally, changes and concerns related to an increase in industrial marine shipping traffic, increase in pollutions, contaminants, plastics, increase in costs and overabundance of certain species due to overarching management decisions that conflict with traditional practices. Many of these changes listed above related to human actions occurring from outside of the Arctic. Hopefully, all of this stresses the need for multiple knowledge and multiple discipline approaches, that one size does not fit all, and the need for us to connect scales. To this last point, the way that we decrease risk and have adaptive responses is through strong relationships, communication, and trust and respect across these scales. This requires a paradigm shift from top-down approaches to also rely on community-driven approaches. Many communities hold solutions to adapting and mitigating changes that are occurring. We need to work together on this. We need to flip the current approach upside down to bring this community part up. One tool to aid us in this work is a co-production of knowledge. Again, there is a growing awareness of the need for this tool, but we do not all hold the same ideas about what this means. To aid in this discussion, some colleagues and I put together this paper. Here we talk about co-production of knowledge in terms of bringing together Indigenous knowledge and science through equity. A co-production framework underscores the role and value of each knowledge system and different methodologies in getting information. As a side note, please notice the first author's name here. The first author's name is Yuam Chua. This is a Yupik word for spirit of all. One of the authors is Yupik, and we all agree to use this language. Yuam Chua is the first author in recognition that nothing comes from any of us as an individual. We are built from all of the information, experiences, and knowledges that have been shared with us, from human and non-humans, from everything within this world. To have a co-production of knowledge approach, we understand that we need an equitable table. That table or platform is needed from Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists, decision makers, and policy makers to work alongside each other from the beginning to end, from the design stage, deciding what work is needed, what questions to ask, through the analysis and implementation, results and communication, and through the decision-making process. This requires trust and respect. Trust that we all know what we are speaking about and have the ability to analyze our own information, and respect that each of us comes to the table with the credentials needed to be there. For some, this may be degrees and publications. For others, this may mean a lifetime as a hunter, a seed holder, or being an elder. A key part of this approach is that we respect each other's knowledge source as its own and move away from attempting to translate one knowledge into the other. The co-production of knowledge conceptual framework puts forward all of the tools needed. With consideration of time, we're not going to go through all of these pieces today. And ideally, it works best if people spend time reading the paper and then come back for a discussion. But I do want to point out that this is not a check the box exercise. It is not linear, and it requires moving around and going back. It requires getting messy. The paper defines the terms and processes and offers a primarily Indigenous perspective of how this works. Additional key parts to see in this conceptual framework are the need to focus on building relationships, empowerment, capacity. This is in reference to your capacity also. Being intentional and deliberate, ethics, decolonization, sovereignty, reciprocity, and so much more. Taking a co-production of knowledge approach requires a strong intent at every step. This equitable table is not just about research, monitoring, assessments, and how we collect information. As shared already in the previous slides, it's also about decision-making and policy-making. Additionally, equity is also not just about humans. It is linked to our values and how we hold the relationships with everything. Indigenous peoples have been sharing these messages loudly across scales, including at the Conference of Parties for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm trying to get better about not saying acronyms all the time. Also at the Arctic Council and other forums. Here you see a couple of those messages that are being shared through an interview with The Guardian. The truth is that there is a dark history to some conservation efforts that are related to colonialism. We need to respect that there are multiple concepts of conservation, that there is a burden of conservation when focused solely from a top-down approach and through one knowledge or cultural source, and what this history is. We have to face this history. We need truth-telling in order for us to successfully move forward, because we do need conservation measures. We need everyone sitting at the table to equitably determine how to address these challenges, what trade-offs we are willing to take. This presentation touches upon a lot of different pieces, and each one deserves more discussion. It has been intentionally repetitive, and I hope you've heard that. We are only touching on the thinnest surface of discussions and work we need to do. A few takeaways. Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge each have a unique foundation and methodology. They are different approaches to understanding the world. We are often asking different questions and applying different worldviews to decision-making. For example, for many of us, we are taught to follow the weather, follow the seasons, follow the animals. There are key lessons to learn from Indigenous peoples. To understand connectivity, cumulative impacts, and to see the entire puzzle, we need both science and Indigenous knowledge. Successful co-production is rooted in equitable partnerships. How do we get to that equity? It requires all of us to be intentional. Indigenous peoples and Indigenous governance systems are working across boundaries. There's a need to recognize these governments and work being done, to recognize that Indigenous peoples are already crossing scales that can be learned and to work together. There are different concepts of conservation. We need truth-telling to move forward. And we need a paradigm shift. We need to flip the current process upside down so that instead of working always from a top-down approach, we begin to also work from a bottom-up, from a community-driven. We all have to take responsibility to do this. Now, usually we end a presentation with key points, but today we want to end, or I would like to end with a quick reflection on the many tools that will help us to get there. There are many tools that have been developed by Indigenous peoples around the world. These tools are gifts to aid in our collective success. Tools include sharing how decisions are made. For example, in a report from the Inuit Circumpolar Council titled "The Role of Providing," authors share different management practices. Many of these are common amongst Indigenous peoples, such as multi-species focus, to never waste, do not take more than you need, never fight over animals. But the material also talks about why, and the need for values to be included in these practices. Other groups have provided guidelines, protocols, rules, and values for building partnerships, working together, and much more. Here you see only a few. These truly are gifts with an immense amount of wisdom, guidance, and tools for success. There are a lot of commonalities amongst them, such as focus on respect, reciprocity, and listening. You know, on a side note, I sometimes hear people talk about things like that as soft skills, but I'd encourage all of you to not think of them in a hierarchical way that way. These are pieces and practices that we all need just to be able to move forward in respecting our environment. When looking at these tools, it is always important to remember that one size does not fit all. Everything has to begin with a relationship and working with your partner. What are the rules and protocols of your partners? How do they want to see decisions made? Why is all this important? Again, to understand the environment we are part of, to have adaptive, holistic solutions, we need equitable partnerships. We need to learn from multiple knowledge systems. And overall, we need a paradigm shift to focus on community-driven and led efforts to cross both geographic and temporal scales, and to work collectively regardless of borders. Many Indigenous peoples are already doing this. We need to recognize and respect the Indigenous governance structures that are in place. For example, in the Arctic, the Inuit Circumpolar Council works across 4 countries. The Sami Council works across 4 countries. They have been practicing governance across boundaries for a long time. There's also the Nuviala, Inupiat, Polar Bear, and Beluga co-management agreements. These are bilateral agreements. There are vested Indigenous groups across global and national systems, such as the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. There's a lot to learn from all of these groups, and there is often a strong willingness from Indigenous people to work and partner through all of these processes. But these processes do need to be adjusted to support multi-knowledge-based approaches and a stronger ground-up or community-based focus. So this is Nanook. This is Nanook in Agavik in Kaktovik, Alaska. Nanook is an Inupiat word for polar bear, and Agavik is an Inupiat word for whale. The Nanook is not by itself in this picture. It is part of an entire ecosystem, and people are part of this ecosystem. So with that, thank you so much for sharing your time with me, and I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts.